Well, now is time for our next session that will be on European Renewable Energy Directive RED 2 and the EU Refinery of 2030, navigating the world of residues and biofuel technologies. So now for this session, we'll have Flor Lucía de la Cruz, Head of Innovation for Oil and Gas at IDOM. She's Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and her team is working on defining the refinery of the future. We also have Modesto Fernández Gonzalo, Senior Advisor on Innovation in Oil and Gas at IDOM. He has been devoted for the refining and petrochemical industry for 35 years, and he has been a project director of the successful expansion project for Repsol Cartagena refinery, and now is working on the innovation team at IDOM. So please join me to listen their presentation.
But I guess we'll get started. So I'm Flor de Cruz, and I will be presenting on the Renewable Energy Directive and the EU Refinery of the future. So go ahead and get started. So this is a summary of what we want to cover today to address some of the issues and opportunities we've seen with the RED 2. So first, we'll go over the legislation, then electrification and hydrogen, some of the feedstocks affecting RED 2. And then lastly, we'll talk about technology and a bit of a summary and how this all ties in with the CapEx and OpEx involved with the different opportunities we have or that RED 2 gives us. So as you've probably heard several times during the past presentations, the EU has issued a revised Renewable Energy Directive back in 2018. So the directive states that 14% of transport fuels must be of renewable origin by 2030 and allows member states to increase the target as they see fit. It further breaks down this requirement into the following categories shown on this graph. So as you can see, it limits food and freight crop biofuels to 7%. Then it limits glucose and animal fat-based biofuels to 1.7%. It requires member states to incorporate at least 3.5% of advanced biofuels, which are produced from feedstocks in Annex 9 Part A, and we'll go into the details of that in a bit. And lastly, it doesn't actually set a limit for recycled carbon, green hydrogen, or renewable electricity, but we have seen through the sets of multipliers that it applies to each of the different feedstocks and the biofuels produced from those, that renewable electricity, the amount of energy you have from this can be counted by 4. So it's indirectly incentivizing the electrification of transport. And that's very important, we think. And then along those same lines, it allows member states to double count advanced biofuels and glucose and animal fats. So we analyzed the 27 national energy and climate plans and found that 25 member states increased their REST target. And this was anywhere from 28% in Spain to 45% in Finland and up to 52% in Sweden. And then analyzing some of these drivers, we also found that 15 member states were driven for opting for mainly advanced biofuels in their mix of energy or renewable energy, and that 12 member states opted for electrification. And then some of the drivers that led some of these member states to go one direction or another, we found were a combination of things. For advanced biofuels, we saw that it had lots to do with availability of raw materials and the logistics that those implied. And this we saw specifically in several member states, as you can see on the map on the right. The brown ones or the gold orangey color representing the ones opting for advanced biofuels. In Italy, for example, they have lots of animal fats available, which is why they're opting for that route. We also saw that for some member states, they have a very old existing vehicle fleet, which also makes it harder to electrify because it's mainly based on diesel. And lastly, we also saw that low population density spread over a large surface area just makes it much more difficult to electrify the grid. Okay. And then when we looked at electrification, the drivers were very similar. It was also availability, but in this case, it was availability of renewable electricity for the production of green energy. And this was a case such as in Spain, where we have lots of wind and solar, or Ireland, which has lots of offshore wind. We also saw that lots of member states with an existing highly electrified rail infrastructure really capitalized on that for the transportation of goods to further reduce the amount of fuels or fossil-based fuels that they had on the market. And then similar in advanced biofuels with a low population density, with the member states opting for electrification, we saw that they had a high population density, such as the case in Germany. And we also saw that they had most of the population was based around major cities, which again makes it much easier to electrify. And ultimately, we have seen that refiners have to really look at these same overall key factors, but also really look at their refinery configurations and their local diesel pool demands to ultimately decide whether they opt for electrification, advanced biofuels, or a mix of these two to better meet their local market and their local demands. So now we'll quickly go over to Modesto. So he goes on to a bit more details on electrification and hydrogen. No te...
Conéctate si quieres, ¿no? Okay. Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Modesto Fernández. Sorry for this little mess that we have over here when we have had some difficulties with the hardware. You know, the legal frame we just saw sets the rules for the coming years, and the 4 times multiplier is really an incentive to electrical mobility. I will be showing to you some information and share some thoughts that hopefully will be useful. You know, this is the electrical system in Spain. The installed power capacity is 110 gigawatts. And, you know, 50% of that is renewable, as you can see on your left-hand side, mostly wind. The rest of the remaining 50% is mostly combined cycle, but also coal, nuclear, and cogen, as you can see. The demand of the country is around 30 gigawatts hour every hour. And that is covered, last year was covered with renewable sources at around 37%. Interesting to know that the utilization of the system is very low. Interesting to note that the utilization of the renewable part is also very low, about 20%. And the variability of the renewable source can go, for wind, for instance, can go from 2 to 60%. Now, there are plans in the country, the National Energy Plan, which basically intends to extend the capacity from 110 gigawatts to 160, all of it renewable. And the intention is to accomplish 74% of renewable electrical source, let's say. Now, the demand will increase only from 30 to 33 gigawatts, as you can see, mainly because the national plans foresees that about 5 million vehicles will be electrical by that date, which maybe is a little bit optimistic. But in any case, there is an interesting thought associated to this. You know, as a result of this revamp of the renewable power, the wind power generation will be around 50 gigawatts, with the variability we mentioned before, 2 to 60%. 60% of 50 is 30, so it means that there will be portions of time where wind only will cover 90% of the demand. What makes absolutely necessary to have some kind of backup, some kind of storing system to that energy that otherwise will be wasted. And that storing system is certainly hydrogen. There is no other system that can allow to do that in a more or less massive way. Two messages out of this point. One, the electrical or the power growth is a business opportunity. Refiners will have to start to look at that as an opportunity. And two, hydrogen is also an opportunity for these situations where the excess of energy will be available. But it's also a must, because otherwise, any additional gigawatt installed will have less and less profitability. Let me move on a little bit. Supply always follows demand. The point here is whether demand will follow supply. It seems that certainly the technology is mature enough on the supply side. The point is whether the technology is mature enough on the demand side. If we have a look at compare the diesel, gasoline automobile with the electrical fuel cell automobile, what we find is that the small vehicle, light duty vehicle, commuting type of activity is well covered. It's an affordable vehicle with low running cost, and that will certainly help in start to conquer the market. It's already starting to conquer the market. It's a little bit more difficult for long range type of vehicle where the autonomy, charging times are a little bit more in compromise, and certainly the structure will have to develop. But if the technology matures a little bit more, the long range part of the demand will be covered, and then will start to be an issue. Hydrogen, on the other side, the fuel cell vehicle is not so competitive so far, but certainly will be there, because as I mentioned, it's absolutely necessary to ensure that the whole thing is profitable enough. Fueling will be hydrogen fueling station will be a reality for refineries, whether they want it or not, to accomplish this balance that was mentioned before. And also on the industrial side, I would like to point out that the refiners are really in a privileged position, because there is no demand to be created. The demand is already there. If refiners do talk a lot about the integration. Now, if you have power generation and demand already integrated, that's a really good advantage, because as soon as that excess of energy is available, it will be sent, or there will be a sink where that hydrogen production can be consumed right away. There are other opportunities for integration, but I will pass. I will pass them. We can cover that in the Q&A session later, because we are running out of time. So back to Flor.
So now we want to go over some of the feedstocks I mentioned earlier. And that's pretty much your new raw material, which is why we want to focus on that for a bit. So if we start looking at feedstocks, we really have to start talking about the current landscape, which is based on the mandate of the original Renewable Energy Directive, which really incentivized or motivated the member states to produce biofuels from food and feed crops. This had the unintentional effect of leading to deforestation and, in turn, higher GHG emissions. The new directive tries to fix this error by placing that maximum of 7% we talked about, and not allowing member states to increase the amount of biofuels from food and feed crops by more than 1% of the value that they had in 2020. When we look at the food and feed crops and what technologies are available to produce biofuels from these, we see that traditionally they were produced from FAME biofuels, so a very simple process. But we also have the possibility to produce an HVO biofuel today. And when we look at both of these, one of the things we see is that overall they have similar properties of FAME diesel versus an HVO diesel. The CO2 emissions are similar. However, FAME diesels do have poor cold properties. And one of the plus sides of HVO is that you can actually produce renewable jet fuel, and HVO produces other renewable drop-in fuels. So one of the things that refiners really have to consider is when they're looking at converting maybe an existing FAME plant or a blend of FAME diesel that they have into their pool with an HVO, they have to consider two things. The limited feedstock, which will be limited and further limited as these caps and multipliers that the directive impose are only going to get stricter. And we saw this with the high ILUC fuels or the banning of palm oil because of its effect on deforestation in Southeast Asia. We also see that the EU is potentially going to ban a few more oils from being used into or being blended into the diesel pool. So these are all considerations. So having this changing feedstock in mind, refiners might look at HVO as an opportunity to have more of a flexibility to produce either diesel or jet fuel, which they can really capitalize on a bit more. So now when we look at Annex 9 Part A, that 3.5 minimum that member states have to comply with, and that 1.7% maximum in the Part B with used cooking oils and animal fats. Ultimately, these are what are classified as advanced biofuels. And as you can see by the slide shown here, these are completely foreign raw materials, where refiners are used to using crude oil. But this Annex A, or Annex 9 Part A, lists several things such as tall oil pitch, bagasse, which is completely foreign to refiners. Also, the availability of these feedstocks isn't uniform throughout the EU. And an example of this is grape marks and wine lees, which are more plentiful in countries such as France, Spain, Italy, which produce lots of wine. And then again, looking at tall oil pitch, we have a similar issue. Since this is a byproduct of the craft process with pine trees, this is more plentiful in Finland or Sweden. And in other countries, we don't have this residue. And then also, when we look at Part A, B, C, and D, we have lots of biomass fractions. And ultimately, what refiners or member states really have to look at is how much of this biomass is actually being sent to landfill and how much is already destined to a different route so that it can be utilized and not be sent to landfills, essentially, which ultimately reduces that pool of available feedstock. Okay. So when you look at the feedstocks, one of the things that is very important is availability and logistics. And this is when we're talking about the feedstocks in Annex 9 Part A. As I mentioned, they're not available uniformly around the EU. So refiners really have to look at the dispersions and distance because this can have an effect on CapEx and OpEx. They need to look at the density and the feedstock pre-treatment that it requires, because this can also have an effect on CapEx and OpEx. And one of the things that we found that was very important in a study that we completed in one of the regions in the EU was that it is very important to complete a micro availability analysis, because as you can see on this chart on the upper right-hand corner, we analyzed 11 regions for how many kilograms of municipal solid waste they had and how many tons of forestry residues they have. And even though some macro studies can suggest that a certain member state has X amount, it's very evident that it's not evenly distributed among the different regions, and this is just for one member state. We also really have to look at the characterization of the feedstock, because different feedstocks will produce a different product. The product yields will have an effect on the contribution that can be counted towards the REST targets. And other considerations that refiners really have to look at is who is the feedstock owner? Is this public? Is this private? This will have an effect on the price, on the quantity available, the seasonality of these feedstocks. And again, like I mentioned, are there existing applications? And one of the things we've also seen is with UCOs and animal fats, because there is a limited amount available in the market, we're starting to see fraud-related issues where it's not actually UCOs, but maybe a raw oil product being blended. So this is things that have to be considered when deciding which feedstock you're going to use. So if we move on and look at technologies, basically what our chart here shows, on the top hand, we're looking at technologies, and on the left-hand column, we see the feedstocks and residues. And just a clear summary or takeaway point that we can see from this is that oil-based feedstocks can use more mature technologies and lead to a final product. Whereas it's feedstocks from Annex 9, Part A, which we looked at before, which have the issues with availability and logistics, have to depend on less mature technologies and don't produce a final product. They produce an intermediate that then has to be upgraded to produce a drop-in fuel. And again, this has an impact on CapEx and OpEx. So we want to go into some of these technologies we mentioned, and I'm sure we've all heard lots of speeches already on HVO, so I'm not going to delve into that any deeper, but I'm happy to hold a separate meeting with anyone who is interested, so we can go on some of the threats and opportunities we've identified with HVOs. One of the things, like I mentioned before, is the feedstock flexibility that you have with HVOs. Also, in some of the projects that we've completed, we've been able to integrate an HVO unit into the existing refinery configuration and really lower the CapEx cost. So that's the second added benefit of the HVO that can be integrated. And then you have other technologies such as anaerobic digestion. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail with this, but basically it accepts a wider range of feedstocks from Annex 9 Part A, and you can produce a biogas, which can then be upgraded into a final product. On the less mature technology side, we have pyrolysis. Here, one of the key things you really have to look at is the characterization of the feedstock, because that will ultimately define your final product. If we look at gasification, this accepts similar feedstocks to a pyrolysis, but it requires higher energy consumption and steam and oxygen consumption. So again, this will affect your OpEx, the long term. So these little factors, you really have to go into detail when deciding which technology and feedstock to select. And lastly, we have hydrothermal liquefaction. This is one of the less mature technologies. It has similar products to pyrolysis. And one of the added benefits is that because it does use water in the process, it can accept aqueous biomass into the process. So if you have that kind of feedstock in your region, this is something that you could potentially consider. So in summary, the new regulation really sets a framework for the refining business during the next decade, and it is certainly a challenge. The legal framework really encourages refiners to include different kinds of fuels in their diesel and their fuel pools, and to include different kinds of fuels based on different feedstocks, such as oils, fats, non-recyclable waste, nutshells, corn cobs, as we saw in Annex 9. We really have to analyze the raw material availability and the pretreatment needed, because this will have an impact on logistic costs, mixed with the many alternatives of the technologies available with different product yields. And ultimately, this will impact the quality of the final product you're putting into the market. So based on our experience, it's very important to properly select that feedstock and technology combination that is best suited for each refiner, and to properly select and so that you can have a good match between your CapEx and OpEx without allowing logistics to have too much of an impact. So this is, as you can see on our last slide, a bit of some of the factors that we think are very important for refiners to consider when deciding which route to take. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Flor, and thank you, Modesto, for doing this live. We have some questions, but we will skip them because we are short of time. Apology for that. In any case, one of the questions was related to the challenge of the availability of some of these feedstocks, and I believe that you already touched this. So thank you for being with us today, and thank you for your